What we've looked at so far is really, well, one argument. We'll see the other argument today in how Jesus is seen predominantly as the basis from which the author is seeking to make sure that the readers are in a position to see the ascendancy of Christ over the cultic system of the Mosaic law. The first argument, which has been you've looked at in the last couple of weeks, has to do with Jesus being the Son of God and superior then to the angelic host in his position as the Son of God and being born as a human being. The second argument, which I'm going to deal with now from chapters 5 through 8, is an argument that depends upon a fairly sophisticated understanding of the way the author uses the Old Testament. And to do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background um, and assume, of course, that you've read the material of the required reading, and at the same time, to recognize that the difficulties in terms of deciding who the author is, whether it's Paul or Apollos and so on. And by now, I'm sure, especially if you've read Paul's epistles a number of times, you can sense the differences between Paul's letters and the author of the epistle of Hebrews in the way that the arguments are structured. It's only when you get to the latter part of Hebrews, as you will in a couple of weeks, that you will see how Paul's work gels with the Hebrew writer, especially in the personal remarks that are made in Hebrews chapter 13. But up to this point, we've seen that the Hebrew writer is writing not a personal letter at all, but rather a sort of an expansive epistle that deals with a long-running argument that begins with its foot straight forward from verse 1 in terms of in the former days it was this, God spoke by the prophets, but now he's spoken by a son. And as I said, the beginning first four verses of chapter 1 is a prologue, really, that opens up everything that's going to be said from there. It was said from the first four chapters in terms of the Son being the Son of God and so on, and his supremacy of the angels. And now we're going to see the Son being defined as a high priest, which takes us then into the Jewish system of things that we have to have some knowledge of to understand what the argument is, which then means that the recipients of Hebrews, the letter, then would be conversant with this. They'd be conversant with the sacrificial system that the Jewish covenant was based upon. But also, more than that, they'd also be conversant in some way with the way that the author dealt with the sacrificial system. And that takes me into then the idea of um, a way of understanding the sacrificial system, because we don't just come into a view of things based upon the raw material that's before us. We use the raw material based upon our understanding of how to interpret that material on the basis of the presuppositions or the suppositions we have, our own prejudices or our own methods of understanding things as they are. For example, when I first started university a long time ago now, 50 years ago, 1971 in New Zealand, uh, one of the courses I took was in philosophy, and I studied Descartes, a French philosopher, and I learned his method of doubt. And the method of doubt was this: that when somebody says something to you as being true, what you do is you doubt whatever you can. In other words, you question whatever you can, and then you reject whatever you can't see as being rational, and then you accept whatever's left. And I have to say, for the most part, that's what I've followed. And it's got me into a lot of trouble. It's got me into a lot of trouble with Christians because I find many Christians through the years simply accept what anybody says. I mean, especially people who are in ministry, who are preaching, they just accept it when it's said from the pulpit. Whereas the first criteria, which I've actually put in terms of Acts 17:11, the Bereans examining the scriptures daily to see if what was said to them was true. I think that's an application of Descartes' method. Well, we do the same thing here. In other words, what we're trying to do here is to look into the sort of prejudices or minds or methodology of the Hebrew writer here to say where is he? We think it's here. Here, I don't think it's Priscilla who's the author of this epistle. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background here because there's two essential ways of looking at this, and you'll have more in a couple of weeks to be able to assess this more deeply. Is this a thoroughly Jewish writer who is coming at it from a completely Jewish perspective that would be explained simply by his uh, um, concurrency within the Jewish tradition of his time, the Pharisaic tradition, or is this someone who has assimilated another tradition and he's part of it? And what I'm thinking here is I'm thinking of the Hellenistic, the Greek tradition that was assimilated by Jews, in particular from the uh, early part of the 3rd century, following the ascendancy of Alexander the Great and the way that he moved through the Near East, and then through the Seleucid period of people like Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, especially when he conquered the Jerusalem complex and forced the Jews to be in a situation which led to a revolt through the Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus and his sons, uh, and really led to the period even through early Roman ascendancy through Pompey when he went into Jerusalem in 63 BC, in which the Greek way of thinking that goes back to Plato but was brought into that region of Palestine through the exploits of people like Philip of Macedon and, of course, Alexander the Great, was the impact of Greek thinking upon Jewish thinking. And it's called Hellenism. And so that they were Jewish Christians who were intellectuals who absorbed this Greek way of thinking, and it filtered through in their ideology. You can check this out, for example, with Philo of Alexandria. Just look on Wikipedia and see how he thought in respect to interpreting Jewish scriptures. And there's a strong line of thought of people uh, like Luke Timothy Johnson, who's written on the New Testament, writings of the New Testament. And it's mentioned by Jobes in particular in her work on Hebrews. And I just want to give you just a very brief background on it. The background basically goes back to Plato, and it's the idea of the separation of worlds, the notion that the phenomenal world, the world of phenomena, is the world of what we would call sense, what we can sense, what we can see, what we can feel, what we can touch, that this world is momentary, it's always moving, it's changing all the time, as opposed to a world that's behind that, that's invisible, um, it's unchangeable, and it's a world that is a world of forms. Uh, so that if you take something like a circle, you can draw a circle even with a compass, and it's not entirely a perfect circle. No matter how many millions of circles that you draw, it won't be perfect. But we have the idea of a perfect circle, and from Plato's point of view in the 5th century, the real circle was the unmoving, invisible circle that existed in the world of forms. And the multiplicity of circles that we see in the modern world, our world, and in his world, these were drawn, so to speak, from the form of the circle in the invisible world, so that um, um, uh, um, they were parts or they were derived from it, but they were not the exact thing that was the most real. Uh, Another would be a more abstract notion, for example, the concept of beauty. You go and you look at a house and you see how the house has been shaped by architects and interior and exterior designers, and you say, wow, this is an object of beauty. And then you go and see a statue of your favorite sculptor, and you say, this is a thing of beauty. Now, what is it that unites the house and the statue as a thing of beauty? In other words, what is beauty that's found within objects? It's very, very difficult to define. And so Plato would say beauty is not an object because objects in this world are actually fallen in the sense that they're imperfect. They have characteristics that can't be seen as being absolutely uniform, but in the world that's undivided and indivisible and eternal, the non-physical, non-material world, then this notion of beauty is absolutely real. It's the world of forms. Another word that's used to describe the world of forms, which I've avoided up to this point, is the world of ideas, which you might come across. But it doesn't mean ideas as we think of ideas in our minds. It means something like the world of forms. It's something that is concretely real, more real than anything that we can see. Now, I'll give you an illustration further that is very well known. Plato described a situation where people were in a cave, and in this cave, they were chained to the floor and they were looking on the wall behind the people who were chained to the floor, and they could only look one way, and that was towards the wall. There was a fire, and behind the fire was the entrance to the cave, and the sun was outside, and the sun was sort of shining in as people walked by outside on the road. And as the people in the cave, who could only look one way, and that was that they were looking onto a wall, the shadows that the people cast outside as they walked by were reflected onto the wall by the fire that was burning in the cave. So the people who were chained to the floor saw the shadows of the people walking outside on the wall, but they couldn't actually see the people who were outside. They had no idea of that world that was outside. So that was their existence. That's all they knew. And they talked to each other about these shadows that were there until one day one of them managed to free himself. This is a illustration, if you like, and managed to turn round and then face the glare of the sun in the entrance of the cave, managed to walk out and get outside and see that there were people out there that he or she had never seen before and couldn't fathom it. And after a while, got to realize who they were. And instead of staying out there in this new reality that that person had discovered, he or she walked back into the cave, took up their place next to their fellow prisoners, as they were, and then spent the rest of his or her life doing what? Well, explaining to the others there what the nature of the shadows that they saw on the wall, what the nature of those shadows were. Now, that's a fairly elongated illustration, but I've labored with it because this is going to come into play now as we look at those chapters from chapters 5 through 8 in Hebrews, because of the element of the way that the writer interweaves historical events with actualities that connect with the sacrifice of Jesus and moves between what you might call, what we would call today, perhaps an earthly existence and a heavenly existence, but which could be easily interpreted in the first century by a Hellenized Jew, that is, somebody who's trained in both the Hebrew scriptures, especially the scriptures that were written in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, who had been trained in um, uh, a Greek way of thinking, like Philo of Alexandria, and then began to deal with the problem that was being addressed. We've only got hints of it so far, which I'll gather together at the end of what I'm saying now, and also in 2 weeks' time, to the point where it might explain why the author puts his argument in the form that he does. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing that you have to do here is that you have to sort out in your mind the historical parts of what the argument is about. And that means you have to place them in a certain um, pattern. This depends upon your understanding of the Old Testament. You have to know then obviously the law, the Torah, the placement then of the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus and Leviticus and so forth, and then the development of the nation of Israel in the land of Canaan, and especially with the use of the tabernacle, which was sort of like a what would you call it, a sort of a wandering worship place that the Hebrews carried around with them until the ascent of the permanent place that was built by Solomon, the first temple. There were two temples, the second one by Herod. The ascendancy of the temple by Solomon, where then the worship place became permanent. And so this is interesting because in the chapters we're dealing with, the author doesn't dwell upon the temple at all. He dwells upon the tabernacle, and there's a reason for that. All right, so what have we got? We've got Genesis, and then we've got a particular figure in Genesis. The obvious figure that the author's going to draw upon is Abraham, because Abraham is the source of the Jewish race, because from Abraham, of course, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, right through with the Israelites, 400 odd years in Egypt, and then Moses is called, and Moses leads them out through the land of Canaan, and then we have the 12 tribes and so forth, right through that history that leads ultimately to Messiah Jesus. But now, what the author wants to do is to show the superiority of Jesus over the law that was instituted by Moses. So that obviously tells us then that whatever was going on here, these Hebrew Christians were either confused in some way or were being led astray by being encouraged to go back in some form to the law in some form, or an interpretation, an aberration of the law, or a previous understanding of the law that was antagonistic or inimical to the Christian faith that they had received. So now, from that standpoint, then you look back and you go back to a passage as you see this, and you come across this notion. Where does this argument start that the author wants to bring about? Well, he goes back, and he's already introduced Moses. He's already talked about the difference between the people of God that Moses represents, the people of God that Jesus represents, and compares it to a house. Moses was the servant in the house, and Jesus was what? He was the son. So the son is greater than the servant. But now he goes beyond Moses and goes back to Moses, goes back to beyond to a sort of a one-time situation to a person called Melchizedek, and you've read that in Genesis chapter 14, and there's only two references in the Old Testament to Melchizedek, the one that's in Genesis 14, and then one that's in Psalm 110. And they're both very important because, again, Abraham is the founder then of the Jewish nation. But Abraham, when he was on his way back after defeating some kings, comes across this person, Melchizedek. And what does Melchizedek do with Abraham? He's what? He receives a tithe from Abraham. And Melchizedek blesses him. And that's all we hear about Melchizedek. We know it says in the account he's a priest. And then I'm going to read this. This is important from Psalm 110. Now, and this is said. This is written approximately 800 years. I'm giving a rough figure here after the events of the time that Abraham met Melchizedek. This is Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, we've come across this already, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. All right, so here's an argument for the divinity of Christ. The Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle, arrayed in holy splendor. Your young men will come to you like dew in the morning's womb. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. In other words, then he's uttered an oath. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now that's hanging there, so to speak, in the Old Testament, that God says to the Lord here, the Messiah, that the Messiah is a priest, and that he's a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek then is one who has a sanction as a priest. He was known as he was what? Salem, he was, number one, he was king of Salem, and Salem is the earlier name of Jerusalem, so king of Jerusalem, and he was a priest of righteousness, and yet we have no element of his jurisdiction. This is prior to Abraham, and Abraham offers him a tenth of his a booty that he got. So where does Melchizedek fit in? He doesn't. So then the author pulls Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews, pulls Melchizedek out, and what he wants to say is this Melchizedek person is very, very important because he is a player who, in a sense, undercuts the whole Levitical priesthood and therefore the whole covenant that God made with Abraham. And he precedes it. And therefore, the author wants to say he nullifies it. Because when Abraham was in a situation where he honors Melchizedek and receives a blessing from him, then Abraham was can you follow this argument? That Abraham, in his loins, had the whole Old Testament covenant deal, so to speak, in himself, so that the lineage that was to come from that, i.e., the genetic lineage of Moses and the 12 tribes and the tribe of Levite, which Jobes brings out, which is a really good thought in terms of the whole sacrificial system that was ultimately involved. What she says, 17,000 priests. And just to get a taste of this, if you haven't read it in depth so far or heard it in Bible classes and from sermons, just read the book of Leviticus. The constant, ongoing sacrifices that would go on to bring about the purification of the nation of Israel, the sacrificial system of the blood of bulls and goats that would go on every day in the tabernacle and then later on in the temple, right through to Jesus' time in Herod's temple, to the point where where the tabernacle and temple are so indicative then of the element of atonement that on one day of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the chief priest, i.e. the high priest, would go into the Holy of Holies on that one day each year and make atonement for his own sins and the sins of all the people. That would be necessary. Now that's all that then this writer is saying all that was in the loins of Abraham, and Abraham paid tribute then to Melchizedek. Now that means then that the superior one is Melchizedek and the inferior one is Abraham. Now that's a tall order to make, to say that Abraham is inferior to someone, because Abraham is the father of the Jewish race. Now, by making Abraham inferior to Melchizedek, now then you've undercut then the whole sacrificial system, and then going on 800 years later into the Psalms and saying, look, on a traditional understanding of the Psalms that David wrote this, that then tying that suddenly in with Messiah figure and what, as it says, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. In other words, he made a statement that you are a priest forever. The Messiah is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. That's how then the Hebrew writer has got his authority to be able to say that the priesthood of Jesus then gets its prominence and its authority from Melchizedek, because it's in the lineage of Melchizedek, because Melchizedek himself, what would you say? There's a sense in which Melchizedek if the Levitical Aaronic priesthood, because the Aaronic priesthood is mentioned in these chapters, is a type, a shadow of the body, which is the Melchizedek priesthood, because it's the inferior to the superior, much like the circles in the Platonic tradition were inferior to the form in the invisible eternal world in the Platonic tradition, the Hellenistic tradition that was ascendant amongst Jewish Christians and influenced by Greek culture from certainly from the 2nd century BC. Then you can see then that the writer then would actually states it. He puts all of that what I'm calling as a type into he actually uses the word shadow. He actually he actually puts all of that type into the loins of Abraham and says, he says, Abraham is inferior to Melchizedek. Now, I'm saying then if the author here then in Hebrews, using Psalm 110, and he's using it in the book of Genesis in the Torah prior to the establishment of the law in Exodus 20, and then using it 800 years later from the Psalms, in other words, the authority of David who wrote this, then what is he saying? Is he saying that Melchizedek also is somehow he's a type of Christ? Melchizedek, there's no reference to him having been imbibed with the priesthood. There's no reference to his birth or his death. He's sort of there and gone. In fact, the Jewish rabbis had trouble in trying to work out where Melchizedek fitted in, because that's the only reference you've got apart from what's in Psalms. And this is how can I put it? This is a brilliant move by the Hebrew writer to tie Genesis 14 in with Psalm 110, because it gives him the basis of this argument that undercuts then the argument from the Aaronic priesthood, because he's now got a situation in which he can argue and say that what Christ has done is now superior to the sacrificial system. Number one, the sacrifices of bulls and goats can never take away sin, and that was part of obviously the Aaronic priesthood. Number two, and he's already mentioned this, that Jesus was sinless. Now, whether that was his main argument in respect to Jesus being the Son of God, being God himself, chapter 1, whether it was an implication from him being God, or whether it was an implication from him being sinless and not part of the Aaronic priesthood, because the Aaronic priesthood, as you know, the high priest had to offer sins for himself, which meant that he was imperfect. Whereas the Hebrew writer's argument is that the Son of God did not have to offer sins for himself, and therefore, in that sense, he could represent the people in a far better way than the high priest could. He didn't have to atone for his own sins. And three, he did this only one time, whereas the high priest and all the other priests, the high priest had to do this one time a year. The priests had to do this one time every time they were representing the people. Why? Well, because they could only do it for a certain time, because they would die. Whereas the Son of God did not die, but ascended to heaven. So the idea is you've got to decide, and you see where Job's comes from out of this. Although she bases a lot of her argument on the book of Acts in the first chapter, that the ascendancy of Jesus in the way that he goes into and cleanses the sins of his people it's either in the resurrection of Jesus, or it's in his ascension to God. And Jobs wants to say, on the basis of Hebrews 1 and 2, that it's when he ascends into heaven, when he sat down at the right hand of God. I think she makes a poor argument there by saying that the priests and the high priests there were no chairs in the tabernacle or in the temples, because they couldn't sit down, because they had to keep standing up and offering the sacrifices, whereas Jesus sat down at the right hand. Well, that's an extrapolation of an argument that I think if the Hebrew writer wanted to make that, he would have made that, and he didn't. So I think that's pushed a bit far for me, as well as the element of using the book of Acts to advocate the ascendancy is the place, the ascension is the place where where the atonement, the forgiveness of sins took place, as opposed to the death, burial, and resurrection. I'll leave that for you to look at. But the main idea then that we're seeing is that the Hebrew writer has taken the death, burial, and resurrection and ascension of Christ and has applied it now to the Aaronic priesthood with all the different mechanisms that go on a daily and yearly basis, and said, look, this system is flawed. It doesn't remove sins. It's temporal because it goes on and has to be repeated every year. And the implication is, if you go back to this, look at the end of chapter 5, I think it is. Yeah, the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, where the idea seems to be that you don't understand these things because it looks like you're going back to it. Now, whatever that means, I think it does mean somehow that these are Hellenized Jewish Christians, and that's why this argument that the writer is making, which makes a lot of sense from a Hellenistic Jewish perspective, because you can see from what I said at the beginning regarding the use of Platonic ideology, if I can say that, of forms. What are the forms? Well, we know what the types are. The types are the Aaronic priesthood, the whole system there that's temporal, that's imperfect. What's behind it all that gives it the form, if you can apply the Platonic world into the Jewish world of the cultus system, what gives it its validity of being perfect is that the world of the cultus system on the earth was only a type of what Christ has done, because number one, he's a perfect high priest who went into heaven, made atonement for our sins before God, and has purified all of us in the heavenly realm, the undivisible, unmoving realm, in that world there, and then has sat down at the right hand of God. He's achieved it all, if you accept that. So therefore, don't go back into that sort of sensual world. Don't go back into the blood of bulls and goats to see that that's where you get your forgiveness from. And if you do that, then Hebrews chapter 6, what you're doing is you're crucifying Christ again. You're denying your Savior. You're going back to the elementary teachings of you can't you've missed out. It's not just that it's an aberration of the gospel. What you're doing, if you follow this, is that you're denying the gospel completely. I think that's it. You've got to consider that. And you could do a point on this. If look at the Hebrews 6 verses 1 through 8, and you could type in Google and you could say something like a Calvinistic interpretation of Hebrews 6 1 through 6. Because a Calvinist would say that those verses don't talk about you losing your salvation and falling away. They have to explain it in another way. Whereas I think the line of argument I'm giving you is that the Hebrew writer is saying, if you follow this line of where you're going back to the Aaronic priesthood, that you will follow. You will fall away. Now, he does say in the verse after that, he says, I'm convinced of you. I think what he's saying there is he's encouraging them now, saying, don't do this. Don't be this way. Follow my argument. And of course, his argument, I'm going to finish now, his argument is now back to the what I'd call the textual historical argument, which is then based upon his interpretation of Genesis 14 and Psalm 110. Okay, I'll leave it at that.